18th century medicine was so creepy that it has inspired horror directors for decades. When you think about treatments that involved powdered mummy remains, major loss of bodily fluids, leeches, and worse, I think you'll agree. 18th century professional medicine was heavily influenced by the science of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers placed particular emphasis on empirical knowledge and what they described as scientific method. That is, knowledge verifiable by reference to experiment, experience, or first-hand observation. This whole thing was applied to every aspect of human thought and activity. While superstitious beliefs were not promoted in the professional textbooks, practitioners occasionally mentioned details when they encountered them. In 1735, John Atkins comments about weird practices in his book, A Voyage to Guinea, Brazil, and the West Indies. He notes that a British naval surgeon saw a prominent person wearing devices that couldn't be identified on his wrists and his neck for their perceived medical effect. Can't say what it was, but think of it like some kind of mysterious amulet. Just the word that John originally used, we can't, because in today's modern age, it has a much raunchier definition. In 1785, George Motherby wrote in his dictionary that the history of amulets and charms dated all the way back to ancient times. The appeal was that they did not offend the palate. They were cheap, and one could indulge in superstition. Also, some patients thought that their practitioners had a connection with a superior being if they wore them. This connection was used to impress and persuade patients to believe in the power of the charms. Motherby noted, as the mind affects the body, so in some cases the persuasion of the patient might contribute to a cure. Think of it like an early way of describing the placebo effect, just with amulets on your wrist. Blistering was an aggressive treatment to the skin and essentially created pain in one spot to counteract pain elsewhere. So let's prick you here, hurt you here, and you're gonna forget about your foot. Among the issues and problems blistering was thought to correct or aid were hysteria, gout, certain types of simple inflammation, and fevers. Also apparently insanity. A blistering agent, such as mustard or Spanish fly, would be applied in a poultice, so like a fabric thing, to the skin, causing redness, and extreme cases, a raised pus-filled blister. So you would just use that, really hot, put it on the skin, and draw everything out, apparently. Honestly, this is one case where the cure might have been worse than the disease. One of the most rare ingredients commonly used by doctors of this time period was powdered Egyptian mummy. Mummy was regularly imported from Egypt, although some apothecaries made cheap imitations. Powdered mummy was used to treat asthma, tuberculosis, and also severe bruising, apparently. Surprisingly, mummy was readily available, if you knew who to ask. You know, which apothecary has this in stock? Heck, a cheap imitation can be prepared at home by dipping a joint of meat in a booze and smoking it like a ham. Every bit as effective as the real thing, and a rather tastier sandwich filling. Allegedly. Those in Victorian high society were actually trading their evenings watching a play for, having their evenings with mummies. Allow me to explain. Mummy parties or unwrapping parties were all the rage. Yeah, this was the social thing to do. This is where imported Egyptian mummies would be unwrapped at private parties just for funsies. Not for any kind of historical element, just to brag. This particular wave of mummy mania began in 1798, following Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt, where he sought to develop French trade links in Egypt and Syria. This campaign allowed Europe's wealthiest to develop this new interest and travel to Egypt themselves, bringing a couple of oversized souvenirs back with them. Just an extra suitcase. Mummies were kind of easy to get in Egypt. You could get one from a grave robber. Really quick, really cheap. Both sides of the transaction did not afford the deceased any level of dignity or respect. This was a fun and exotic novelty. You'd forget that it was a human. But it was the ideal party piece for the wealthy communities who have everything. Look, we're not gonna completely blame grave robbers. Even though they were desecrating their country's history, they just wanted to get their money, they wanted to help support themselves and their families. People were just like, this sounds fun. Emergency care was kinda strange way back when compared to modern day medical care. CPR didn't exist. So doctors use one of three methods to treat an unconscious person. Number one, which is kind of similar to today, shock somebody back to life by provoking an extreme reaction. Doctors believed that if they could get somebody to sneeze, cough, or upchuck enough, then they'd come back, which, okay, in theory, we're getting somewhere. These reactions were achieved by poking stuff up an unconscious person's nostrils or pouring something toxic down the throat. And some of these compounds included mercury, which we'll get more on in a moment, arsenic, and other poisons, hemlock, nightshade. Well, I imagine if the poison didn't kill them, then, well, maybe pneumonia would get them later. The second and most widely used method to treat somebody who was kind of uncompromised would be, well, getting rid of human redness. Pretty popular one. This was a pretty common remedy. This was performed for thousands of years, dating back to ancient Greeks, Egyptians, so forth and so on. Ancient people believed that it was one of the 4 humors in the body, and that, well, some illnesses were caused by an imbalance or an excess of that lovely redness. We'll chat more about that next. The third and most popular method of emergency resuscitation was called Dutch fumigation. This included blowing smoke from something you would smoke up somebody's rear end. Apparently, this was very successful. But now is the perfect time to talk about the process of getting rid of excess human redness. This popular method of treatment was done slowly, using leeches, or if you had to do it quick, just open up an artery or a vein. Unfortunately, if you survived the fluid loss, you might die from hemorrhaging, sepsis, but it was a super common practice until like the late 19th century. Even George Washington had the procedure done to relieve a throat infection in 1799. Over 40% of his redness was removed over an 8-hour period. So did the throat infection end his life, or was it from just this crazy procedure? Let me know in the comments. Cups made from antimony, a toxic metallic element, became super popular as a means of purging the body of illness through sweating and upchucking because, well, poison. It's gotta go. Wine would be allowed to stand in the cup for up to 24 hours, by which time a small amount of the metal would have dissolved into it. It has been suggested that the cups were introduced in order to get around the law at a time when the sale and use of antimony preparations was strictly forbidden. Wonder why? When making such a preparation, 3 tablespoons of antimony could cause the desired effects, but it would be highly unpleasant. Bowed legs, thickened wrists and ankles, low weight, and deformities of the skull and pelvis are all signs of rickets, a very common disease of the 18th century and really prevalent during winter months. This is caused by a lack of vitamin C, leading to soft, weak bones that don't mineralize properly. The symptoms usually appear super early in a human's life, and if you catch it that early, the disease is reversible by ensuring a proper diet of vitamin D-rich foods, so fatty fish, egg yolks, fish oil, and also kind of exposure to sunlight. Very important. 18th century physicians knew about the disease and discussed the symptoms and possible remedies in their medical books, but they didn't understand the actual cause, and therefore they didn't know how to cure the damn thing. And although rickets is often associated with folks living in poverty with limited diets or restricted to sunless living and working conditions, it affected folks of all socioeconomic levels. John Freak, in his 1748 book, An Essay on the Art of Healing, felt the diet of the victims affected by rickets was, in general, too luxuriant and should be scaled back to a more scrappy diet. Care should be taken to send this sort of human into a sharp air and rousing them by shaking them and tossing them often, giving them now and then a little bit of a red boozy drink, and dipping them every morning in cold water. Like, yeah, okay, he was spot on. Let people go outside. But restricting their diet would have only deteriorated any patient. If doctors needed to force the body to reject everything through the lower end back in the 1700s, they couldn't just prescribe, an iced coffee, a bucket of licorice, a gallon of milk. Those are way too modern of a idea. They'd force several spoonfuls of Buckthorn Syrup down your throat, intended to empty the rear end. Back to the topic of purging, by the way. The 1710 book of Physics was a recipe book of natural remedies using plants and minerals to cure the everyday ills and complaints of the sick. So if we're gonna treat rickets this way, the first step was to administer a purge. So that's a drink that flushes everything out of your digestive system, either one way or the other. Purgatives were a cure-all for a lot of diseases, because, well, if you're sick, we gotta get what's sick out of you, right? So the recommended purge was made of a long list of plants: liverwort, speedwell, yarrow, mixed with fruits such as figs and raisins, all slowly simmered together in water. The dosage was 3 spoonfuls every morning and every night for 14 days. The most common purgative was calomel, a form of mercuric chloride, which worked as a laxative in small doses, but usually was prescribed in really big doses just to get everything out. Taken orally, this is a very potent cathartic, which is a sophisticated way of saying it's gonna violently empty out your guts into whatever you've got. Constipation had long been associated with sickness, so opening the rectal gates of hell was a sign of righting the wrongs. Allowing bile to flow freely was in harmony with keeping the body balanced and everything happy, which was a theory that dated all the way back to like Hippocrates. And look, in theory, if the insides of the bowels were dark and slimy, wasn't it better to get rid of that? Finally, mercury pills were pretty popular for treating syphilis from like the 17th to the 19th century. If you didn't know, syphilis is a disease that was transmitted through intercourse caused by the bacterium and has 4 stages. 3 of those 4 have manifestations on the skin of the sufferer. So with treating that, we now know that mercury is bad. But what exactly were the side effects of The Mercury? Well, let's see. There's a neurological disorder that includes depression, anxiety, pathological shyness, frequent sighing. Combine that with tremors of the limbs. Well, all of this put together was called Mad Hatter's disease, or Hatter shakes. Not pleasant. Well, that's it, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya.